The wedding dress had been folded in a cedar chest for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and Rosa Shepard knew the exact count because she had stopped herself from burning it on at least 40 separate occasions. The town of Redemption, Texas sat stubborn and sun-baked along the banks of the Pecos River in the spring of 1882, a place where the wind came in hot off the desert flats, and the dust never fully settled, not even on the windowsills of the homes or the tops of the church pews. It was a town of ranchers and trail hands, of general store debates and Sunday sermons that ran long, of gossip passed between women at the water well and men who leaned against fence posts pretending they weren't listening. It was the kind of town where a woman who had been left standing at the altar did not simply disappear into the wallpaper. She became a story. She became a lesson. She became, whether she wanted to be or not, a symbol of something that other women whispered about to their daughters as a warning. Rosa Shepard was 26 years old, which in Redemption in 1882 meant she was considered by most to be well past the easy years of marriage, and well into what the older women called the difficult stretch. She had dark brown hair that she wore pinned up during the day and loose at night when she sat by the window and read by lamplight. Her eyes were the color of good river clay, a deep amber brown that shifted toward gold when she was amused and toward something much darker when she was not. She was tall for a woman of her time, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that some people mistook for coldness and others, the ones who looked more carefully, recognized as survival. She ran the town's seamstress shop, which had been her mother's before her mother passed from fever in the winter of 1879. It was a small building wedged between the barber and the hardware store, with a front window that she kept clean, and a sign above the door painted in her own hand that read SHEPARD alterations and fine sewing. She made wedding dresses for other women. She hemmed trousers for ranchers who came in smelling of cattle and sweat, and barely looked at her when they handed over their garments. She repaired saddle bags and canvas work aprons, and the Sunday clothes of children who grew too fast for their mothers to keep up with. She was good at her work in the way that people are good at things they have done out of necessity long enough that the skill becomes part of their bones. The man who had not come was named Gerald Forsyth, and he had ridden out of Redemption on the morning of what was supposed to be their wedding day, claiming he had urgent business in El Paso. He had sent a letter 3 weeks later explaining that the business had led to other business and that he had found, in the course of that business, a woman in New Mexico whom he had married in a courthouse ceremony. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. He had not apologized in any of them. Rosa had read the letter once, folded it with great precision, walked to the iron stove in the back of her shop, lifted the lid, and dropped it in. Then she had gone back to work on a hem she had been finishing before the post rider arrived, and she had not cried in public about Gerald Forsyth. Not once, not ever, though she had permitted herself exactly one night of weeping into a flour sack pillow before deciding that she was done. The dress remained in the cedar chest. She was not done with the dress. She had made it herself, of course, which was how Rosa made everything. She had spent 4 months on it, working in the early mornings before the shop opened and in the late evenings after she closed. The fabric was ivory cotton with a fine weave she had ordered specially from a merchant in San Antonio, and she had sewn seed pearl buttons down the back, 32 of them, each one stitched with a double thread so they would not pull loose. The bodice was fitted with painstaking precision to her exact measurements, and the skirt fell in soft panels that caught the light in a way that was simple and beautiful without being extravagant. There was lace at the cuffs, and at the collar, real lace that she had tatted herself over 2 winter months, and the hem was hand-stitched in a pattern so fine that you had to look closely to see it was not plain but decorated with a repeating motif of small flowers, barely there, like a secret. It was the finest thing she had ever made. It was the most painful thing she had ever kept. She could not give it away because she could not bear the thought of seeing it on another woman in this town. She could not sell it because it had been made to her measurements, and altering it for another figure would require taking it apart in ways that felt, to Rosa, like dismemberment. She could not burn it because she was not, despite her practicality, entirely without sentiment. So it stayed in the chest at the foot of her bed, wrapped in a length of clean muslin, and she tried not to think about it, which meant she thought about it constantly. It was on a Tuesday in early April that David Slater rode into Redemption. He came in from the north, which was unusual enough to make the men at the livery stable look up from their work. Most trail riders came in from the east along the main road, or from the south following the river. North was mesa country, dry and rocky, and not hospitable to horses that hadn't been raised for that terrain. But the horse David Slater rode was a big blue roan with the kind of legs that meant business, and the man himself sat in the saddle with the easy authority of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He was 31 years old, though the years had a quality to them that came from being lived hard and outdoors rather than from being old. He had a lean, angular face with a jaw that needed shaving and dark eyes that moved over a room or a street the way a hawk's eyes move over a field. Not predatory exactly, but watchful, taking in everything and giving away very little. He wore a brown canvas duster that was road dusty, and a hat with a creased crown that had been mended along one side with a strip of rawhide. There was a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, and he carried them the way working men carried tools, without ceremony and without display. He was a cattle drover by trade, though the word drover covered a range of things in 1882 Texas. He had moved cattle up the Kisham Trail twice in his 20s, had spent a winter working as a ranch hand for a spread outside of Abilene, and had for the last 3 years been riding for a ranching outfit out of Laramie that sent him south in the spring to scout range and negotiate grazing rights, and occasionally to deal with the kind of trouble that came when men disputed whose grass was whose. He was good at all of it. He was particularly good at the kind of quiet, steady negotiation that settled disputes before they became something worse, which was a skill that surprised people who looked at him and expected a man who solved things with the revolver. He rode to the livery first, as all sensible men did, and arranged for his horse to be fed and watered and given a proper stall rather than just a hitching post. He paid the livery boy a fair price and did not haggle, which the livery boy noted because haggling over the stall rate was practically a sport in Redemption. Then David Slater walked up the main street of Redemption, Texas, with his saddlebags over one shoulder and his eyes moving steadily over the fronts of the buildings, reading the town the way a man reads a trail, looking for what it told him about what was ahead. He needed a room, which meant the hotel. He needed a meal, which meant the hotel dining room or the saloon. He needed, though he had not fully admitted this to himself yet, something that no amount of trail riding or cattle negotiation had so far provided him, which was a reason to stop moving. He didn't know any of that yet. He just needed a room and a meal, and if he was honest, a bath. The hotel was called the Pico's House, and it was run by a widow named Mrs. Abernathy, who was 60 years old and ran her establishment with the precision of a military campaign. She gave David Slater a room on the second floor that had a window facing east and a bed with a real mattress and clean sheets, and she charged him a fair rate and handed him a bar of soap without being asked, which told him she had assessed him in about 4 seconds and decided he was the sort of man who would pay his bill and not break the furniture. He slept for 10 hours, which was the sleep of a man who had been riding hard for too long. In the morning he ate breakfast in the hotel dining room, which was where he first saw Rosa Shepard. She came in to deliver Mrs. Abernathy's repaired church dress, a dark green wool that she had let out in the bodice and re-hemmed, and she carried it over her arm in a way that kept it from touching the dusty street outside. She walked through the dining room to find Mrs. Abernathy, and she passed within 6 feet of where David Slater was sitting with his coffee and his eggs, and his intention of minding his own business. He looked up. It was not the look of a man who stared at every woman who walked past. It was something more specific than that, more unwilling, the way you look up when something moves at the edge of your vision, and you turn your head before you've decided to. She was carrying the green dress with careful attention, and there was something in the way she held herself that made the room feel different, not louder or brighter, but somehow more organized, as though things had settled into better positions around her without noticing they'd done it. She did not look at him. She delivered the dress to Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen doorway, collected what appeared to be a small payment, exchanged a few quiet words, and walked back through the dining room and out the front door. He watched her go without meaning to, and then he looked back at his eggs and finished them and told himself that was that. It wasn't that. He asked Mrs. Abernathy, with what he hoped was casual interest, who the woman with the green dress was. Mrs. Abernathy looked at him over her spectacles with an expression that told him his casual interest had fooled absolutely no one. "That is Rosa Shepard," she said. "She runs the seamstress shop on the main street. Her mother ran it before her. She's a fine needlewoman and a sensible woman, and she's had enough nonsense from men to last her several lifetimes. So if you're asking for reasons that are not about having your shirts mended, I suggest you conduct yourself accordingly." David Slater nodded and said he would keep that in mind. Mrs. Abernathy said, "See that you do," and went back to her kitchen. The business that had brought David Slater to redemption involved a grazing dispute between two ranchers, a man named Holt who ran cattle on the north side of a creek called Dry Cedar, and a man named Vargas who ran cattle on the south side of the same creek, and believed that the property line lay several hundred yards further north than Holt's survey suggested. The Laramie outfit that employed David had interests in the matter because they held a note on Vargas's operation and wanted the dispute resolved before it turned into something that damaged the value of their investment. David's job was to look at the land, read the surveys, talk to both men, and find a line that they could both agree on without anyone getting shot. It was the kind of work that kept him in redemption for longer than a single day or a single week. It was the kind of work that required riding the land in the mornings, sitting across tables from angry ranchers in the afternoons, and writing careful letters to the Laramie office in the evenings. It was, he found, the kind of work that also gave him good reasons to walk up and down Redemption's main street between the hotel and the land office and the telegraph office, passing the seamstress shop with its clean front window several times a day. He did not go in for 4 days. On the 5th day, he had 2 shirts that genuinely needed mending, one with a torn collar and one with a seam that had given way along the left shoulder from the repeated action of mounting and dismounting a horse. He held them up in his hotel room that morning and examined them with the critical eye of a man who was lying to himself about his reasons for examining them, and then he folded them and put them under his arm and walked down to the seamstress shop. The bell above the door made a small bright sound when he pushed it open. The shop was warm and smelled of clean fabric and something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, and it was organized with the same quality he had noticed about Rosa Shepard herself, everything in its place and the place carefully chosen. There were bolts of fabric along the back wall and a long work table in the center of the room, and a sewing machine of the newer Singer variety near the window to take advantage of the light, though there was also a basket of hand sewing near the chair beside it. The walls had several framed samples of embroidery and lacework, demonstrations of skill rather than decoration, though they were decorative too. Rosa Shepard was standing behind the work table with a length of dark blue fabric spread before her and a piece of chalk in her hand, marking a line that corresponded to some measurement she had apparently just taken. She looked up when he came in. Up close, her eyes were exactly the color he had noticed from across the hotel dining room, that deep amber brown, and they were looking at him with the polite, assessing expression of a woman who had learned to take the measure of strangers quickly. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you? I have 2 shirts that need some work," he said, putting them on the work table with what he hoped was straightforward practicality. "Torn collar on this one and a split seam on that one." She set down her chalk and picked up the shirts one at a time, turning them to look at the damage with the same kind of focused attention she had given the blue fabric a moment before. Her hands were quick and capable, the hands of someone who worked with them all day, and there was a small callus on the side of her right index finger from the constant pressure of a needle. "The collar is a clean tear," she said. "That's straightforward. The seam on the shoulder will need to be properly reinforced or it'll go again in the same place. The fabric's sound, but the original stitching was too shallow for the kind of work this shirt sees." He was surprised by the specificity of that assessment. "You can tell that just from looking at it." "I can tell from looking at it and from the pattern of how it failed," she said, setting the shirt down. "If it had torn at random, you'd have a weak spot in the fabric itself. This tore along the original seam line, which means the stitching pulled rather than the cloth giving way. Shallow stitching does that under repeated stress." She looked up at him. "You ride a great deal." "Most days." "Then you need a deeper seam or it won't hold." She looked back at the shirts. "I can have these ready by Thursday." "That would be fine," he said. "I'm David Slater. I'm staying at the Pico's house." "I know," she said, without apparent significance, and he remembered that in a small town everyone knew where the strangers were staying. It wasn't a remarkable piece of information. "I'll write you up a ticket." She wrote his name on a small slip of paper and told him the price, which was reasonable, and he paid half in advance without being asked, which was not always done and which she noted with a slight shift in her expression. Not quite a smile, but something in that neighborhood. He said, "Thank you, Miss Shepard," and she said, "Thursday morning," and he walked out with the small bell sounding above his head. He thought about her for the rest of the day, which was inconvenient because he had a meeting with Holt in the afternoon and needed to be paying attention to survey lines. He thought about her in the evening while he was writing his letter to the Laramie office. He was not a man who had much practice with what he was feeling, partly because he had spent the last decade moving too consistently to let anything take root, and partly because the one time he had tried to let something take root, in the form of a young woman in Abilene 6 years ago, who had subsequently married a banker, because the banker had a house and David Slater had a horse. He had concluded that the mathematics of his life did not favor that particular kind of investment. He had not been bitter about it exactly. He had been practical. He had moved on. He was aware, in the same practical way, that the feeling he was carrying now was different in some way from simple attraction, though it was certainly that too. There was something in the directness of Rosa Shepard, in the precision of her assessment of his torn shoulder seam, in the way she had not made small talk or batted her eyes, or done any of the things that women in small towns sometimes did when a new man arrived, that made him feel as though he had encountered something genuine in a landscape that was largely performing itself for his benefit. He wrote his letter to Laramie. He went to bed. He thought about Thursday. On Wednesday afternoon, he was riding back from the disputed creek land, trying to fix in his mind the relationship between 2 survey markers that he had spent the morning examining, when he passed a woman walking along the road that ran parallel to the main street. She was carrying a basket, and she had her hat pushed back on her head in the manner of someone who had forgotten it was there because she was thinking hard about something else. It was Rosa Shepard heading, he assumed, toward home from the direction of the general store. He slowed his horse. "Miss Shepard," he said. She looked up. The afternoon light was full on her face, and her eyes went from that preoccupied middle-distance look to direct focus on him in a single instant. "Mr. Slater," she said, "your shirts won't be ready until tomorrow." I said Thursday. "I know," he said. "I wasn't coming about the shirts. I was just passing." There was a pause in which she appeared to decide something. "Then I won't keep you from passing," she said, with a dryness that was not quite unfriendly. He found himself dismounting anyway, which had not been his conscious intention. He walked alongside her horse and she walked beside him with her basket, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the afternoon went on around them. A mockingbird in a mesquite tree, the distant bawl of a calf somewhere to the east, the sound of the wind. "How long will you be in Redemption?" she asked. "Depends on the work," he said. "Could be another week or two, could be longer." She nodded. "What kind of work?" "Grazing dispute. Two ranchers arguing over a creek and a property line. I'm trying to find a survey that satisfies both of them before it turns into something uglier." She glanced at him with what might have been mild interest. "You're good at that kind of thing." "Settling disputes." "Usually," he said. "Not always. Sometimes people want the fight more than they want the solution." "That's true of more than grazing disputes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." They had arrived at the point where the road forked, one branch leading toward the main street and her shop, the other toward the quieter residential side of town where the small houses sat. She paused at the fork. "Your shirts will be ready by 9 o'clock Thursday morning," she said. "I'll be there," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those amber-brown eyes, and then she said, "Good night, Mr. Slater," and took the branch toward the main street. He stood at the fork for a moment longer than he needed to, then remounted and rode to the livery. He collected his shirts on Thursday morning. She had done the collar perfectly, and the shoulder seam was reinforced with exactly the kind of deep, careful stitching she had described, double-threaded and precisely spaced. He turned the shirt inside out right there at the counter to look at the seam, and she watched him do it with an expression that was professional but not entirely without pleasure at being appreciated for the quality of the work. "This is very good," he said. "That's why I charge what I charge," she said. He laughed. It surprised him, the ease of it, and she looked at him with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth that was the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her so far. "Can I ask you something?" he said, which was forward, and he knew it. "You can ask," she said with the careful precision of someone who was not promising to answer. "Would you have dinner with me at the hotel? Mrs. Abernathy runs a decent dining room." The pause was longer this time. He did not try to fill it. "Why?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not a deflection or a coy invitation for more persuasion. She wanted to know his reasoning. He thought about it honestly. "Because I've been in a lot of towns," he said, "and I don't usually feel like I've met anyone in them, and I feel like I've met you." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and he could see something working behind her eyes, some calculation that was more complicated than what it appeared to be about, and he did not know yet what that complication was. "Friday evening," she said. 7 o'clock. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I haven't decided whether I'm glad I said yes." He carried his shirts back to the hotel with the distinct sensation of being a man who had just done something that was going to change the direction of something, though he couldn't have said what. The dinner on Friday was at a corner table in the hotel dining room with a lamp that threw warm light across the white cloth and the simple dishes that Mrs. Abernathy's cook prepared. There was a roasted chicken and bread and string beans put up in the fall, and a dried apple pie for dessert. And the food was good in the plain-spoken way of food that is made with proper care rather than pretension. Rosa Shepard arrived exactly at 7, which told him something about her, and she was wearing a dress of deep blue that was clearly her own work, the collar and cuffs finished with a detail that was subtle and precise. She had her hair differently than during working hours, still pinned but with more care, and she sat across from him with the posture of a woman who had decided to be here and was going to be here entirely rather than halfway. They talked through the chicken and the bread. She told him about growing up in Redemption, about her mother who had been the seamstress before her and who had taught her to sew by having her practice on feed sacks before she was allowed to touch real fabric. She talked about it without sentiment, but with a particular quality of attention that told him these memories mattered to her in ways that ran deep. He told her about the trail drives, about the particular loneliness of moving cattle across open country for months at a time, about the beauty of the high plains in early morning and the misery of a Texas river crossing in flood. He told her about Laramie and the work there and the strange half-settled quality of a life that kept moving without actually going anywhere. "That sounds exhausting," she said. "It is," he said. "I'm starting to think that's not the same as it being necessary." She tilted her head slightly. "What would you do if you stopped moving?" "I don't know," he said. "I think that's the honest answer. I've never let myself think about it long enough to find out." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense that his honesty had cost him something or gained him something. He couldn't tell which. "I've been in one place too long," she said. "I suppose we're the opposite problem." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe we're the same problem from different directions." She looked at him across the table, and for the first time the expression on her face was not assessment or caution or professional composure. It was something more open than that, something that acknowledged that this conversation was happening in a register that was different from small talk, and that she was choosing to stay in it. They ate the dried apple pie. He walked her home in the soft dark of the April evening, not asking if he could, just falling into step beside her as she left the hotel. And she did not object or redirect the conversation toward a farewell that would have ended things at the door. The street was quiet, a few lights in windows, the sound of someone's fiddle from the direction of the saloon, the smell of mesquite smoke from cook fires that were burning down for the night. At the door of her house, which was a small two-story behind the shop with a porch that had a single rocking chair and a pot of something green beginning to grow in the corner, she turned to face him. "I had a good evening," she said. "I wasn't entirely sure I would." "Neither was I," he said. "That's an honest thing to say on a first dinner," she said. "I'm finding it difficult to be anything else around you," he said, and he said it simply, without drama, and she received it the same way, without girlish excitement or false modesty, just with the quiet steadiness of someone who understood that something real had been said. "Good night, Mr. Slater," she said. "David," he said. A pause. "Good night, David," she said. He walked back to the hotel in the April dark, feeling something he could not immediately name, something that sat in his chest with more weight than loneliness and more warmth than anything he was used to. The grazing dispute between Holt and Vargas was not resolving itself quickly, which David was increasingly glad of in ways he didn't fully examine. The survey question came down to a discrepancy between two different records, one filed with the county in 1871 and one filed with a land office in 1874, and the two documents disagreed about the location of a particular corner marker by a distance that translated into several hundred acres of grazing land. David spent 3 long days riding the land and comparing the documents and consulting with an elderly man named Patchett who had been surveying in that county since before either rancher arrived, and who had opinions about the 1874 survey that were strong and colorful. He also, in those same 3 days, found himself twice more in conversation with Rosa Shepard in ways that were neither accidental nor entirely deliberate, but occupied the interesting territory between those two things. Once in the general store where they were both buying necessities, and once in the late afternoon when he walked past her shop and saw the lights still on and knocked to ask if she was still working. She had been. She had a deadline on a dress for the blacksmith's wife who was going to her sister's wedding in San Antonio, and Rosa had misjudged the amount of time a particular piece of decorative work would take. She let him in because it would have been peculiar not to, and he sat in the chair near the window because there was nowhere else to sit and talk to her while she worked. And she talked back without looking up from her sewing, because she couldn't spare the attention from the needle, but she didn't want him to leave either, which was a fact she was noting about herself without having decided what to do about it. He asked her once, watching the lamplight move across her hands, how long she had been running the shop on her own. 3 years, she said, since my mother. That's a lot to carry, he said. It's mine, she said. Carrying it is part of having it. He nodded at that. She heard the nod in the silence and looked up briefly. You understand that, she said, not a question. I understand working for something that's yours, he said. I don't have anything like that yet, a shop or a place. But I understand the principle of it. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at her work. "What would yours be," she asked, "if you had one?" He was quiet for a moment. "Land," he said. "I think, something that stays where you put it." She laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that transformed her face entirely, and he realized that he had been waiting without knowing it for that sound since the morning he had seen her in the hotel dining room. "That's a very good reason for land," she said. He left when the lamp started to burn low, and she said she needed to concentrate on the final section without conversation. And he said good night, and she said the same, and he stood on the main street of Redemption in the late evening dark, and thought that he had not been this reluctant to leave a room since he could not remember when. 2 weeks after he arrived in Redemption, on a Saturday afternoon when the shop was closed and the town had the particular loose quality of a day without obligations, he was walking along the street when he passed the cedar chest. He had not known it was a cedar chest. He had not known it existed. What happened was that he had come around the corner of the building where Rosa's shop sat, and found her sitting on the back step of the shop in the side alley, which was in shade in the afternoon, and caught a small breeze from the west. And she was sitting with her back to the wall and her eyes looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone who has been thinking hard and has not arrived anywhere satisfying. "Rosa," he said, because they had been David and Rosa for several days by then, and it no longer required any particular decision. She looked at him, and the expression shifted. She moved over on the step to make room, and he sat down next to her in the alley shade. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, because her face invited the question. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a cedar chest in my bedroom. I've been thinking about it for an hour, which is probably an hour more than it deserves." "What's in it?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and he had never quite seen her face arranged in exactly this way, something between humor and pain and defiance and exhaustion. "A wedding dress," she said. He did not say anything immediate. He let the words be what they were. She told him about Gerald Forsyth. She did it without drama, in the same even tone she used for most things, but he could hear the work it took to keep it even, and he respected the work. She told him about the 4 months of sewing, about the seed pearls and the lace she had tatted herself, about the morning of the wedding that didn't happen, about the letter that she had burned in the iron stove. She told him the dress was still in the chest, and that she couldn't quite make herself deal with it. "I'm not still in love with him," she said clearly. "I want to say that plainly. I'm not sitting here pining. I'm something else about it. I'm not entirely sure what." "Angry," he said. "Yes," she said, "and something past angry. Something that sort of settled in like a scar." He nodded. "And the dress," she said. "I made that dress. I made every stitch of it. It was the best thing I'd made up to that point, and probably still is. And it's sitting in a chest like something dead, and I can't throw it out, and I can't give it away, and I can't keep ignoring it." He looked at her. "Can I see it?" he said. The question surprised her. He could see it in the way she went still. "The dress," she said. "Yes," he said, "if you'd let me." She stared at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read her expression. It was too complicated for easy reading. Then she said, "Why would you want to see it?" "Because you made it," he said. "Because you made every stitch of it, and it's the best thing you've ever made, and it's sitting in a chest being treated like something to be ashamed of. And because I think maybe the reason you can't deal with it is that nobody's ever just looked at it." She held his gaze for a long time, long enough that he began to wonder if he had overstepped. Then she stood up from the step and went through the back door of the shop without saying anything, and he waited, and after a moment she appeared in the doorway. "Come in then," she said. He followed her through the shop and up the narrow stair at the back that led to the rooms above, which was where she lived. It was a small space, tidy in the way of someone who knows where everything is and keeps it there, with a good quality lamp and books stacked along one wall and a braided rug on the floor. At the foot of the iron bed was the cedar chest, dark wood with a brass clasp, smelling faintly of cedar even from across the room. She stood beside it and looked at him. He came and crouched beside the chest and waited. She unfastened the brass clasp and lifted the lid. The smell of cedar rose stronger, and the dress was there in its length of clean muslin, folded with precision, the way you fold something you don't want wrinkled but can't look at directly. She lifted it out and the muslin fell away and the dress was there. He stood up. It was ivory cotton, fine woven, and the seed pearl buttons caught the afternoon light that came through the bedroom window and threw small points of brightness. The bodice was fitted and exact, and the skirt fell in those soft panels, and there was the lace at the cuffs and collar, real lace, the kind that takes a very long time to make by hand, and along the hem, if you looked closely, the small flower motif repeated in hand-stitching so fine it was barely visible. He looked at it for a long time. She held it and watched him look at it. "Rosa," he said, and his voice was different than usual. Something had shifted in it. "This is extraordinary," she swallowed. "It's a dress," she said. "It's the work of someone who put everything she had into it," he said. "You can see it. You can see every decision in every stitch. This isn't something you made quickly. This is something you made the way people make things they're afraid they'll never get another chance at." Her chin had lifted, the way it did when she was holding herself together with her posture because her face was in danger of giving something away. "And he never even saw it," she said, and her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her something. "He never saw it," David confirmed. "Which is his loss and his shame, not yours." She looked at the dress in her own hands for a moment. "I don't know what to do with it," she said. "Do you still want to wear it?" he asked, and it was a direct question, and he asked it directly, looking at her. She looked at him. The amber-brown eyes were bright in a way that might have been the light and might not have been. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I used to think no. Now I'm not sure." "Then keep it," he said. "Don't burn it and don't fold it back into the chest like a problem. Hang it somewhere you can see it. And look at it every day," she said, with a dry disbelief. "And remember that you made it," he said. "That's what I'd remember." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. Then she folded the dress carefully, not into the muslin and back into the chest, but over the back of the chair in the corner, spreading the skirt so the pearl buttons caught the light. She stood back and looked at it there, hanging over the chair. "That's better," she said, and he heard something in it that was not about the dress at all, or was not only about the dress. He left her house 20 minutes later, and she stood in the doorway and watched him walk back down toward the main street, and she thought that she was in serious danger of something she had specifically decided, after Gerald Forsyth, was not going to happen to her again. She thought that the danger was the good kind, which was the most dangerous kind. He was having similar thoughts in the direction of the hotel, though his were framed slightly differently. He was thinking that he had been in Redemption for 2 weeks, and it had started to feel different from other towns, not in the way of a place you're passing through, but in the way of a place that might hold you if you let it. He let that thought sit with him for a day. On Sunday evening he found her at the church, not at the service, which was in the morning, but in the afternoon when the building was quiet and she sometimes went to sit in the cool interior and think. He had seen her go in while he was walking past on his way back from the Holt property, and he had paused and then gone in. She was in the third pew from the front, on the right side, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of someone who is surprised but not entirely surprised. He sat in the pew beside her, and they were quiet together in the cool interior for a while, which felt, he thought, like something you could only do with someone you were already comfortable with, to not need to fill the silence. "I keep thinking about what you said," she said without preamble. "Which part?" "That you can see every decision in every stitch. That it's the work of someone who put everything she had into it." She looked at the plain wooden cross at the front of the church. "I was afraid when I heard you say it, because it's true and I'd never heard it said out loud before." "Afraid of what?" he asked. She turned to look at him. "That someone could see me that clearly in 2 weeks, when I've been in this town my whole life and no one here has managed it." The silence that followed had weight to it. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what it would mean to stop moving." She held his gaze. "Not just in the general sense," he said, "in a specific sense. Redemption is a small town," she said, "and people talk, and I've already been one kind of story in this town, and I don't intend to be another kind." "I'm not asking you to be a story," he said. "I'm asking if I can court you properly, with your full knowledge of what the word means." She was still for a moment. "You've known me for 2 weeks," she said. 12 days, he said. "I know it's not long. And you've got work in Laramie, you ride for someone else's outfit. You said yourself you don't have land or a place." "That's true," he said. "All of that's true. I'm not pretending those aren't facts." She looked at him for a long moment. 12 days, she said again, and this time there was something in it that was less objection and more wonder. 12 days, he said. She looked back at the cross at the front of the church. "You can court me," she said, "on the understanding that I am not a woman who can be rushed or pressured or made to do anything before she's ready." "I wouldn't try," he said. "And on the understanding that I've been hurt before and I will be exceedingly difficult about it if I feel that happening again." "That sounds entirely reasonable," he said. "Good," she said. She stood up from the pew and straightened her skirt with a small practical motion. "Walk me home." He stood. "Yes," he said. The weeks that followed were some of the most vivid of David Slater's life, though they were not dramatic weeks in the way of gunfights or storms or the kind of danger that made for dramatic telling. They were vivid in the texture of every day, in the increasingly specific knowledge of another person that accrued through the accumulation of small moments. He learned that she took her coffee with no sugar, but appreciated the smell of it in the morning more than anything else, and that she was better at mornings than he was, and made no allowances for people who were not. He learned that she had strong opinions about fabric quality and moderate opinions about most political matters, and very firm opinions about the treatment of the Mexican families who lived on the southern edge of Redemption, in a cluster of small houses that the rest of the town generally treated as invisible. This last opinion she expressed one afternoon when they walked past those houses on their way to the river, and a woman there nodded to Rosa with the warmth of genuine familiarity. "You know her well?" he asked. "Mrs. Ray's," Rosa said. "She brings me work sometimes. Mending mostly, though she's a better hand at embroidery than half the women in this town. She can't get credit at the general store. Mr. Hatch won't extend it." Her voice was level, but there was that dark shift in her eyes. "She has 4 children, and her husband breaks his back on the Vargas ranch for wages that wouldn't keep a single man comfortable, and Mr. Hatch won't give her credit." "Does that happen often?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "To one family or another. It's the way of things here, and I hate it, and I have very little power to change it, which is its own particular frustration." She stopped and turned to look at him with a slight challenge in her face, as though she expected him to offer a platitude about the way of the world. He didn't. He said, "It's wrong, and you're right to hate it." She looked at him for a moment. "You don't feel the need to explain why it's complicated." "It's not complicated," he said. "It's just unfair. Those are different things." She nodded slowly. He had passed some kind of examination he hadn't fully known he was taking. He told her about the Kishom Trail drives and the Mexican vaqueros who had taught him more about cattle than any Anglo drover he'd ever ridden with, and about the Comanche he had met once during a particularly fraught night on the Llano Estacado who had been decent and dignified in a situation where most men would not have been, and about how the West he had ridden through was nothing like the West that newspapers in the East described, because it was full of complicated suffering. Beautiful people of every description who were mostly trying to stay alive and make something worthwhile in land that was magnificent and pitiless in equal measure. She listened to all of this. She talked back. She told him things she had not said to most people, about the loneliness of being the town seamstress after her mother died, about the way people came to her with their most important occasions, their weddings and baptisms and funerals, and left the garments and left their stories and left her alone again in the shop. She told him that she loved the work and she loved the shop, and she was sometimes, particularly in the winter, profoundly lonely in a way that the work could not entirely fill. He reached across the table and took her hand when she said that, which was the first time he had touched her deliberately, and the warmth of it traveled up her arm and settled somewhere in her chest, and she did not pull away. The grazing dispute reached its resolution in the 5th week of David's time in redemption. He had found, with the help of old Patchett and a very careful examination of a creek bed landmark that both surveys referenced, that the 1871 document was correct, and the 1874 document had been made with an instrument error that had shifted the reference point by approximately 300 yards. He presented this finding to both Holt and Vargas with the kind of clear, patient explanation that left little room for further argument, and backed it up with Patchett's testimony, and a diagram he had drawn himself that showed the two survey reference points and the physical landmark they both pointed to. Holt accepted it because the 1871 survey favored his position. Vargas accepted it after a day of furious resistance because his lawyer, reached by telegraph, told him the case was not winnable. David wrote to the Laramie office informing them of the resolution and requesting further instructions. He was sitting with the letter to Laramie in his hand in his hotel room, and he was thinking about what the further instructions would say. They would send him somewhere else. There was always somewhere else. Another disputed creek, another fractious rancher, another town that he would pass through and leave behind. He put the letter down and sat with his hands on his knees and thought about what he actually wanted. He wanted to stay. He wanted this specific town and this specific shop and this specific woman who assessed torn shoulder seams with professional precision and tatted her own lace, and had stitched a wedding dress with 32 pearl buttons for a man who had not deserved a single one of them. He wrote a second letter to the Laramie office, which he wrote after the first and before he went down to dinner, and in it he tendered his resignation from the outfit, thanking them for 3 years of work and noting that he intended to remain in redemption and establish himself there. He was polite and direct and clear, and he sealed both letters and would send them the next morning. Then he went downstairs and ate his dinner and thought about how to do the next thing correctly. He did not rush. That was the first thing he decided, because Rosa had told him she would not be rushed, and he understood that this was not a standard female protestation, but an actual statement about what she needed. He gave it another 2 weeks, which were 2 more weeks of evenings at her dinner table, and walks along the river road and conversations that went deep in the way of conversations between people who are figuring each other out with the earnest seriousness of people who mean to get it right. He told her about the letters to Laramie on a Thursday evening at her kitchen table after she had fed him a stew that had dried beans and salt pork and the last of the winter squash in it and was extremely good. She listened to what he said about resigning. She set down her fork. She looked at him across the table. "You did this before you talked to me," she said. "Yes," he said, "because it wasn't about you. It was about what I wanted. I didn't want to stay here because of you. I wanted to stay here and I want to be with you, and those are 2 separate decisions and I made them separately." She looked at him for a long time. "That's exactly the right answer," she said. "Is it?" He said because he had not been entirely sure. "Yes," she said, "because if you'd said you were staying because of me, I'd have been afraid of what happened when things got hard. But staying because you want to be here and wanting to be with me because you want to be with me, those are things that can bear weight." "What kind of weight?" he asked, and he was asking something more specific than the words alone. She held his gaze. "The kind that comes with time," she said. He reached into the pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small inset turquoise that caught the lamplight with a blue-green flash. He had bought it from the silversmith on the edge of town 2 days ago, paying for it with the last money from the Laramie job because it had the kind of plainness and the kind of beauty that made him think of her and not of anyone else. "I'm not asking you to answer tonight," he said. "I'm asking you to know that I'm asking." She looked at the ring, then she looked at him. "Where would you put the shop?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "If you settled here, you'd need work. You can't live on air. Where would you put yourself in this town's economy?" He had thought about this. "Land, eventually. I have enough saved for a small parcel. I can work a ranch while I'm getting the land going. Holt has offered me work, actually. He was impressed by the dispute resolution. She nodded slowly. Holt's a fair employer, she said. He's difficult, but he's fair. Rosa, he said. She looked at him. I am 31 years old, he said. I have spent the last decade moving because I was afraid that staying meant failing. I have met you and I understand, in a way I did not understand before, that the thing I was afraid of failing at is exactly this. And I don't want to be afraid of it anymore. The room was very quiet. She picked up the ring from the table and held it in her palm and looked at it. The turquoise is beautiful, she said. I thought so. It matches nothing I own, she said. You could make something to match it, he said, and she laughed, and it was the full, genuine laugh that had been rare and precious every time he'd heard it. She set the ring back on the table between them. Come back tomorrow evening, she said. Come for supper. And I'll give you your answer then, she said, because I want to give you a real answer and not a dinner table one. He picked up the ring and put it back in his pocket. Tomorrow evening, he said. She walked him to the door and he said good night and she said good night and he walked down the front porch steps and she watched him go from the doorway. And when he was halfway down the path, she said, David. He turned. I think I'm going to say yes, she said. I'm telling you that because you've been honest with me and it seems only right to be honest back. But I need tonight to be sure in the way that I need to be sure. He looked at her in the lamplight from the doorway. Take all the time you need, he said. She went inside and closed the door. She went upstairs to her bedroom and she stood in front of the chair where the wedding dress still hung, because she had left it there after David had suggested it and had not moved it back. It caught the light from the window, the seed pearls gleaming softly, the lace at the cuffs precise and delicate. She had made this for a man who had not seen it. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the chest and found the muslin and she lifted the dress carefully from the chair and she laid it on the bed and she looked at every stitch of it, the collar and the bodice and the 32 pearl buttons and the lace she had tatted through 2 winter months and the hem with its hidden flowers. She had made this. Every stitch of it was hers. She thought about what David had said, that it was the work of someone who had put everything she had into it. She thought about the way he had looked at it, carefully. The way he looked at everything, like the looking mattered, like seeing something fully was the least you owed it. She thought about a man who, when she told him she had been hurt, had not said he was sorry in the particular way men said they were sorry when they meant it wasn't their fault. He had said it was wrong. She thought about a man who, when she talked about Mrs. Ray's at the general store, had said the injustice was not complicated. It was simply unfair. She thought about a man who had tendered his resignation from his work before he asked her anything, because he had understood that staying needed to be its own decision. She folded the dress very carefully, differently than before, not back into the chest, but into its muslin wrapping laid across the top of the cedar chest where she could see it, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room and she was certain. She had been certain since somewhere in the middle of the conversation, if she was honest, but she had needed the night to be sure in the way she needed to be sure, which was the same way she needed to check every stitch twice before she cut the thread, not from doubt but from the habit of care. He came the next evening at 6 and she had cooked a proper supper, not the stew of last night but a roast chicken with potatoes and onions and a pie made from dried peaches that she had been saving for a particular occasion. He came in and smelled the food and looked at her and she looked at him. Sit down, she said. We'll eat first. He sat down. They ate the chicken and the potatoes and the pie, and the conversation was easy in the way of people who no longer need to work at conversation, because it has found its own current and carries them along. He told her about Holt's job offer and what it would involve. She told him about a commission she'd received for a dress that was to go all the way to a woman in Dallas and what that meant for her shop's reputation. When the plates were cleared and the lamp was burning down toward its last good light, she reached into the pocket of her apron and set the ring on the table. He had given it to her the night before. She had kept it, turned it in her hands while she thought, set it on the windowsill where the turquoise caught the morning light. "Yes," she said. He looked at the ring and then at her. "Yes," she said again, with the firmness of someone who has decided fully and said it fully. He picked up the ring from the table and she put out her hand and he slid it onto her finger, and it fit, which seemed like a minor miracle and was probably just a good guess. And she looked at her hand with the ring on it and then looked at him. He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood up to meet him, and he put his hands on her face, gently, the way you hold something that matters, and he kissed her. It was not a brief or formal kiss. It was the kind of kiss that contains an acknowledgement, that says yes to the same thing she had just said yes to, that closes the distance that had been careful and proper and necessary, and that now, finally, didn't need to exist anymore. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with the same straightforward completeness she brought to everything. And when they stepped back from each other, she was slightly breathless, and he looked at her with those dark watching eyes that were, for once, giving everything away. "That's a good yes," he said. "Don't push your luck," she said, but she was smiling, and he laughed and she laughed, and it was the best sound the small kitchen had heard in a very long time. They were married in June of 1882 in the church in Redemption, which was full in the way that small-town churches are full for a wedding, because every soul in the county found an excellent reason to be present. Mrs. Abernathy sat in the fourth row and looked satisfied in the manner of a woman who had predicted this outcome, from the moment she had looked over her spectacles at a trail-dusty man asking about the seamstress. Old Patchett, the surveyor, attended and pronounced the match sound with the same authority he brought to property lines. Holt, David's new employer, came with his wife. Mrs. Rays came from the small house on the south side of town and sat near the front because Rosa had specifically saved her that place, which caused some murmuring among certain members of the congregation that Rosa addressed with a single steady look that caused the murmuring to cease. Rosa wore the dress. She had taken it out of the muslin and hung it on the back of her bedroom door for the week before the wedding, and looked at it every morning while she did her hair. She had steamed it carefully and pressed the bodice panels and checked every one of the 32 seed pearl buttons for security, tightening 3 that had slightly loosened in their years in the chest. She had refreshed the lace at the cuffs with a gentle cleaning, and it was as white and precise as the day she had made it. The hem flowers were still there if you looked closely, which most people did not, but which Rosa knew were there, and which David, who had seen the dress in its unfolded state and looked at it with the attention it deserved, knew were there too. She walked down the aisle of the Redemption Church, and she was not a woman making the best of a situation, or a woman settling for what was available, or a woman trying again with diminished hope. She was a woman who had made something with everything she had, and had kept it through years of doubt and pain, and had found the person worthy of it. David Slater stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and the expression on his face was the kind that could not be performed by a person who did not mean it. It was simply the face of a man who understood exactly what was happening and did not want to miss a single moment of it. The minister, a thin man named Caldwell who had been in Redemption for 15 years, and had seen everything that small towns produce in the way of human drama, married them with a brevity and a warmth that was exactly right. When he said they were husband and wife and David kissed her, the church made the collective sound of people who are genuinely glad, and Mrs. Abernathy produced a handkerchief and applied it without apology. The celebration afterward was in the churchyard under the cottonwood trees, because the day was warm and fine, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf. There was food brought by half the town, and there was a fiddle and a guitar and somebody's aunt who played the dulcimer, and there was dancing on the grass that went until the sky turned orange and pink and then dark blue. And at some point, David lifted Rosa off the ground when they were dancing, and she laughed the full genuine laugh, and he thought that he had been right to stop moving, that this was the place, and this was the thing worth stopping for. They had their wedding supper alone, later in her house that was now their house, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the remains of a peach pie between them, and they talked in the quiet way of people who have just done something large and are sitting with the size of it. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said, without qualification or caveat, which was the most certain she had ever heard herself sound about anything. "So am I," he said, and he meant it all the way down. That first year was a year of building. David worked for Holt in the days and spent his evenings working on the small parcel of land he had purchased with his savings and the small additional amount they had from the seamstress shop, 400 acres of good grass east of town, with a seasonal creek that ran dependably through the spring and well into summer. He was not trying to build a cattle empire. He was trying to build something solid, something that would feed them and hold them and be theirs. He worked methodically and without impatience, the same way he had negotiated Holt's grazing dispute, reading the land the way you read a document, looking for what it told you about what was possible. Rosa kept the shop going, which was their reliable income while the land was developing, and she expanded into making work shirts in standard sizes that she sold to the ranch hands who came through town, which was David's idea and a sound one, because there was a constant market for shirts that could be bought off the shelf without measurement and didn't require a tailor. She hired a girl named Lenora, 17 and eager, who could do the basic sewing and allow Rosa to take on more of the precise work that commanded better prices. They lived in the house behind the shop, and they were, in the particular way of people who have each been alone for long enough to truly appreciate the opposite, thoroughly and unself-consciously glad of each other's company. They fought occasionally, because they were both people with strong opinions and neither of them was inclined to pretend otherwise, but they fought in the productive manner of people who are arguing toward a resolution rather than away from each other, and they generally found the resolution and were glad of having found it. In the spring of 1883, a year after David had ridden into redemption from the north, Rosa told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning when she had been certain for 2 weeks and had been watching him for that time with a private knowledge that she finally put into words over coffee. He set down his cup. He looked at her. He said, "Rosa," in the voice of a man to whom something enormous has just become real. "Yes," she said, watching him. He came around the table and he held her both arms, not briefly, and she put her face against his shoulder, and for a moment they were just very still together in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm glad. Are you?" "I'm absolutely terrified," he said, "and I'm so glad I don't have words for it." "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what I am too." Their son was born in December of 1883, which was a hard winter by Texas standards, with cold that came sharp and early and snow that was unusual enough in that part of the territory to make people talk about it for years. He was a healthy boy with David's dark eyes and Rosa's stubborn chin, and they named him Thomas, after Rosa's grandfather, who had been a capable man she had admired greatly. Thomas arrived in the world with considerable opinion about his own arrival, announcing himself with a volume and vigor that Mrs. Abernathy, who had come to assist as she had apparently assisted at half the births in redemption over the years, said was an excellent sign of good lungs and good character. David held him with the careful astonishment of a man holding something incredibly fragile and important for the first time, and looked at Rosa over the baby's head with an expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely new. "Hello, Thomas," Rosa said, when they put the baby in her arms. The baby looked at her with the unfocused seriousness of the very newly arrived. "He has your eyes," she told David. "He has your jaw," David said. "God help him," Rosa said, and Mrs. Abernathy laughed, and outside the December wind pushed at the windows, and inside the lamp burned warm and steady. The land grew in the years that followed. David bought an additional 200 acres when the parcel adjacent to his came available in 1885, and by 1886 he had a proper cattle operation, modest by the standards of the big ranches to the north and south, but his own, held outright, debt-free and well-managed. He knew his land the way he had once known trails, intimately and specifically, the way water moved through it, and the way grass grew in different spots in different seasons, and which draws were good for shelter when the weather turned. Rosa kept the shop and expanded it. She took on Lenora as a partner in 1885, when Lenora had been working for her long enough to know the business and had the skill to match her ambition. They offered a wider range of goods, and the shop's reputation grew beyond Redemption to the smaller settlements nearby, and people came specifically because Rosa Shepard's stitching was known to be the finest in that part of the territory. She did not stop making wedding dresses. This was the thing some people might have expected her to stop, given the story, but Rosa had no patience for the kind of thinking that said a painful experience ought to cause you to give up the thing itself. She made wedding dresses, and she made them beautifully, and every bride who came to her left with something that would last, and that was made with the kind of care that recognized what the occasion was. Thomas grew into a boy with David's steadiness and Rosa's particular intensity of focus, a child who watched things carefully and did them precisely, and had, by the age of 5, already expressed strong opinions about the proper way to do several things, which his parents found both exhausting and completely recognizable. In 1887, Rosa told David they were expecting again. This one arrived in late spring, a daughter they named Maria after Mrs. Reyes, who had by then become Rosa's closest friend in Redemption, and who had stood up for them both in ways that were not small, including testifying to the county land office on David's behalf in a boundary question that had arisen from a neighboring rancher's attempt to encroach on the eastern edge of their property. The encroachment had been resolved with David's characteristically patient and thorough documentation of the proper line, but Mrs. Reyes's testimony had given it additional weight, and they had not forgotten it. Maria arrived into the world more quietly than Thomas, but with an alertness that was immediately apparent to everyone present, her dark eyes moving over the room with the methodical attention of someone who intended to understand everything in front of her. "She's going to be trouble," David said, with great affection. "She's going to be wonderful," Rosa said. They were both right. The years in Redemption were good years. They were not perfectly smooth years, because life in the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s was not smooth, and there were droughts and difficult cattle markets, and the particular strains that come from building something from the ground up with your own hands and your own resources, and no guarantee of outcome. There was a hard year in 1886 when the beef price collapsed, and they needed to be careful with every cent. And Rosa put in extra hours at the shop, and David took on fence work for 2 neighboring ranches to cover the gap, and they came through it without losing anything essential. There was a season when Thomas was 6 and had a fever that frightened them badly for 4 days, sitting up with him in shifts through the nights while the doctor came twice, and the fever eventually broke, and the boy came back to himself and asked for biscuits. Through all of it they were thoroughly, practically, and deeply in love, which was less like the trembling romantic state of their courtship, and more like the structural thing that a well-built house is, present in every joint and wall and roof beam, visible not in any single dramatic moment, but in the entire form of the thing standing solidly against whatever came. David had stopped moving. He was exactly where he had been afraid to be, planted in specific ground with specific people depending on him, and he was not afraid of it at all. He was, in the quiet particular way of a man who has found the right place, at home. Rosa had stopped being a story. Or rather, she had become a different story, one she had written herself, as deliberately as she had stitched every flower into the hem of that ivory dress, as carefully as she had tatted every inch of the cuffs, as precisely as she had sewn 32 pearl buttons down the back so they would hold. The dress itself had had a quiet final resolution that pleased Rosa considerably. In 1888, 6 years after her wedding, a young woman came to the shop from a small settlement 20 miles east of Redemption. Her name was Annie Garza, and she was 22 and engaged to a farmer named Peterson, and she had no money for a wedding dress and had come to ask if Rosa could make her something in the most economical fabric available. Rosa looked at the girl for a long moment and then said, "Come upstairs with me." She brought her to the bedroom and took the ivory dress out of the cedar chest where it had gone back after the wedding, no longer painful to store there, just stored. She unfolded it and held it up, and Annie Garza's eyes went wide. "What is that?" the girl breathed. "It's a dress I made for myself," Rosa said. "I wore it once and it doesn't fit me the way it did anymore." This was true. 2 children in 6 years had changed her measurements just enough to make the fitted bodice of the dress no longer precise on her body. "It was made to my measurements, but I think we could alter it to yours. You're very close to where I was." Annie touched the lace at the cuff with one careful finger. "I couldn't take this," she said. "It's not a gift," Rosa said. "It's an alteration. I'll charge you for the alterations and you'll owe me for the pearl buttons, which are real and which you'll have forever. That's the cost." Annie Garza looked at the dress and then at Rosa. "Why?" she said. Rosa considered the question honestly. "Because I made that dress with everything I had," she said, "and it deserves to be worn again by someone who will be happy in it. I was happy in it. I want you to be happy in it too." The alterations took 3 days and they were meticulous. The dress came in slightly at the waist and was let out a little in the shoulders, and the hem was taken up 2 inches. And when Annie Garza put it on and stood in Rosa's shop with the ivory cot, and the seed pearls, and the lace cuffs, and the hem with its hidden flower pattern that she didn't know was there, but that Rosa knew. Rosa stood back and looked at it, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time and was now, finally, completely at rest. Annie Garza was married the following month, and she wrote Rosa a letter from her new home that was warm and full of specific detail about the day and what it had meant to wear something so beautiful. Rosa kept the letter. David was there when the alterations were finished and Annie had left, and Rosa was tidying the shop, and he watched her work for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. She looked up from folding the remnant fabric. "Like something has been properly finished," she said. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," he said. She came around the work table and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the shop in the afternoon light. And outside, the main street of Redemption went about its business. And the sign above the door read SHEPARD alterations and fine sewing still, because the name above the door was the name this shop had always had, and the name Rosa had kept professionally, because it was her mother's name and hers, and she intended to keep it, which David had never once suggested otherwise. Thomas came running in from outside at that moment with a scrape on his knee and a story about a horse in the alley that needed immediate telling. And Maria, who was nearly 2 and had recently become firmly ambulatory, toddled in behind him and grabbed Rosa's skirt. And the shop filled with the particular noise of family life, and David looked at Rosa over their children's heads with the eyes that had never entirely stopped being the hawk's eyes that took everything in. Except that now what they took in was this room, and this woman and these children, and this specific life that he had chosen and built, and would keep choosing every morning. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the dark with the stars doing what Texas stars do in a sky without obstruction, which is to demonstrate very thoroughly the scale of things. There was a lamp inside throwing a soft rectangle of light through the window, and the night smell of mesquite and warm dust and something faintly green from the east where the creek ran. "David," Rosa said. He said, which was the sound of a contented man. "I want to tell you something." He turned his head to look at her. "When you asked to see the dress," she said, "I nearly said no. I was on the edge of it, and I'm very glad I didn't." He was quiet, listening. "Because that's where it started," she said. "Not at dinner, not on the back step." Right there in that moment when you asked to see something that was mine and painful and I decided to let you and you looked at it the way it deserved to be looked at. She paused. That's when I knew you were different. He reached over and took her hand. I knew in the hotel dining room, he said, when you walked through with the green dress and didn't look at me. She laughed softly. That's a strange time to know. You looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, he said, and like she'd been doing it alone for a long time. I wanted to know what it was like when she wasn't alone. The night around them was vast and warm and full of crickets, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made a comment that the other coyotes didn't respond to. Is it what you imagined? She asked. Better, he said immediately. Considerably better and different, harder and more interesting and more complicated and better. She squeezed his hand. Yes, she said, exactly that. They sat on the porch until the lamp inside burned down, and the stars had made their slow rotation, and the night had gone from full dark to the faint gray that came before the first light. Then they went inside and went to bed, and Thomas called out once in the night about something and David went to him, and Rosa heard his low, quiet voice settling the boy back into sleep, and then he came back and got into the bed beside her, and in the warm dark she was completely at peace. The years went on in the good way that years go on when they are lived well. The ranch grew to a point where David needed one full-time hand and hired a young man named Ellis who turned out to be reliable and quick learning, and who David trained with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. The shop continued to be the best seamstress operation in the county, and Rosa's reputation extended further, and there were women who came from considerable distances specifically for Rosa Shepard's work on wedding and christening clothes. Redemption grew too, in the way of small western towns in the late 1880s, slowly and then all at once. A new hotel went up in 1889 to replace the Pico's house, which Mrs. Abernathy ran until she was 72, and then handed to her niece. A proper school was established in 1888, which Rosa had been a vocal advocate for since Thomas was old enough for her to think about his education. A doctor opened a permanent practice rather than the itinerant physician they had depended on, which was a significant improvement. The question of the town's Mexican families was slow to change, as these things were, but it changed by degrees. Rosa's quiet persistence in treating Mrs. Reyes and her neighbors as visible members of the community had its effect over years in the way that water has its effect on stone, not by force but by constancy. The new schoolmaster accepted all children without distinction, which was partly because he was a decent man from the East who found the local customs on the subject incomprehensible, and partly because Rosa Shepard had a long conversation with him before his first term that outlined very clearly what she expected from the school she had advocated to establish. Mrs. Reyes's eldest daughter became one of the school's best students, and eventually, years later, a teacher herself. These were not dramatic victories. They were the slow-building kind, the kind that take longer than they should and are more fragile than they ought to be. But Rosa Shepard did not need things to be dramatic in order to do them. She needed them to be right. In the spring of 1890, 8 years after David had ridden into Redemption from the north on his blue roan horse, Rosa told him she was expecting their third child. She told him in the kitchen, as she had told him the other times, over the morning coffee, and he received it with the same astonishment he had received the news both times before, which she found both touching and slightly comic. "You still look surprised," she said. "I'm always surprised," he said. "I think I'm always going to be surprised. It's a miraculous thing. It's a natural thing," she said. "Natural things can be miraculous," he said, and she conceded the point because it was a fair one. Their second son arrived in November of 1890, and they named him James, which was David's father's name, a man who had died in the war and whom David had known only in the stories his mother had told. James arrived with Thomas's volume and Maria's alertness, and the particular combination of his parents' best qualities that children sometimes achieve. A small, quiet miracle in the lamplit bedroom, while outside the November wind did what it did. Thomas was 7 by then and old enough to be told he had a brother, and to come in and look at the small red face with the studied seriousness of a boy conducting an assessment. "He's very small," Thomas said. "You were that small once," David told him. Thomas appeared to find this unlikely. "He'll get bigger," Rosa said. And Thomas looked at his mother in her bed with the baby against her, and something shifted in the boy's face. Some new comprehension of something large and important. And he nodded once with the solemn gravity of a 7-year-old accepting a truth. Maria was 3 and took a more proprietary interest, immediately reaching for the baby with the confidence of someone who had already decided this was hers. "Careful," Rosa said. "I am careful," Maria said, with perfect Rosa Shepard assurance, and held the baby with an unexpected competence that made her parents exchange a look over her head. That look, that exchange over the children's heads, that wordless conversation that carried everything between them, was the truest measure of what they were. It had been there since Thomas was small, and it had only deepened and expanded as the years went on. They had learned each other so thoroughly by now, through the daily accumulation of a shared life, that much of what needed to be said could travel in a glance or the angle of a shoulder, or the particular way one of them went quiet. David Slater had stopped moving. He had planted himself in the ground of this town, and this woman and this family, and he had grown into it the way a tree grows into good soil, deep and wide, and past the point where wind could uproot him. He rode his own land in the mornings and sat at his own table in the evenings, and at night he lay beside his wife in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house and knew every sound for what it was. The settling of the boards and the breathing of the children and the particular quiet of Rosa sleeping. And all of it was his, and he was grateful for it with a depth that he had not known he was capable of before he arrived in Redemption on a Tuesday in April of 1882. Rosa Shepard had found the thing she had been making all along, not just the dress, though the dress had been a beginning of something, not just the shop, though the shop was hers in a way that mattered. But this, the full texture of a life made with intention and care and real love, stitched together with the same patience and precision she brought to everything, tested by time and weather and difficulty, and found to be sound, deeply and thoroughly sound, in every seam. On their 10th anniversary, in June of 1892, David gave Rosa a gift. He had commissioned it from the silversmith in town, the same man from whom he had bought the turquoise ring 10 years before. It was a small brooch, silver, with a delicate design of flowers that could have been decorative, but that was, if you looked very closely, a flower that matched the hidden ones in the hem of the ivory wedding dress. He had described that pattern from memory, from the afternoon he had stood in her bedroom and looked at the dress with the attention it deserved, and the silversmith had rendered it in fine silver wire with a skill that impressed David considerably. She opened the box at the kitchen table and looked at the brooch and was quiet for a moment. "You remembered the flowers," she said. "I've remembered the flowers since the first time I saw them," he said. "You thought nobody looked closely enough. I looked." She picked up the brooch and held it in her palm, and the silver flowers caught the morning light. "I've been trying to decide," she said slowly, "what to say about the last 10 years. "Take your time," he said. "I think what I want to say is that you were right," she said. "When you said I should keep the dress and remember that I made it, that's what I've been doing ever since. Remembering that I made things, that I can make things, that the work is mine regardless of what happens to it afterward." She looked up at him. "You gave me that back. I don't think I'd said that properly." He looked at her across the table. "You had it already," he said. "I just asked to see it." She pinned the brooch to the collar of her dress and stood up, and he stood up, and she put her hands on his face and looked at him the way she had looked at the dress that afternoon, closely and completely. "That was enough," she said. "That was everything." He covered her hands with his, and the morning light came through the kitchen window, and the house around them held all its sounds, the creak of Thomas getting up upstairs, the murmur of Maria telling something to baby James in the next room in the carrying-on way she had with him, the distant sound of Ellis beginning the morning work in the barn. And outside, the June day was beginning to warm, and the sky above Redemption, Texas, was the deep particular blue of a morning that was going to be a fine day. Rosa looked at her husband, and he looked at her, and they were, in this kitchen, in this house, in this town, in this life they had made together stitch by careful stitch, completely and thoroughly and without reservation home. Thomas came clattering down the stairs, and Maria appeared in the doorway with James on her hip, managing him with the 3-year-old's authority that always made both parents work not to smile. And David went to take the baby, and Rosa went to the stove. And the morning opened around them like something that had always been meant to happen, like the right answer to a question that had been waiting years for someone to ask it properly. The coffee was good. The day was fine. The life was theirs.